Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Yuri Slezkine, who is professor of history at UC Berkeley and director of its Institute for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. His most recent book is The Jewish Century. Yuri, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
Moscow, Russia.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
It's a very big question. Well, they were against the regime, so I grew up anti-Soviet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the main contribution, I guess, to my political upbringing.
And was it a very political household that you lived in with your parents?
Yes, there were a lot of conversations about politics.
And for quite a while, you didn't know you were Jewish, but one day you found out a neighborhood girl who you, I guess, were interested in was Jewish. And what did your father tell you?
Well, he actually was a boy, and I found out that he was Jewish, and I told my father. I don't remember how old I was, but anyway, I told my father, did you know that so-and-so from apartment 15 was Jewish? And so my father turned to me and said, let me tell you something.
Mm-hmm. So after he told you, which I guess was that you had Jewish ancestors.
On my mother's side. He himself is not Jewish, but he told me, well, I'll tell you something about your mother. It was quite a blow.
In what sense?
Well, because it wasn't cool to be Jewish.
I see. I see. And after that, how did that reorient you? Finding out that you were Jewish, I mean, was it something you kept inside, or did your political ideas get influenced by that Jewish identity?
Well, the two influenced each other, because being Jewish, since it was not a religious identity, and it was cultural in a certain peculiar sense, so it was political to a great degree, and so being Jewish, at least in Moscow, among the intelligentsia, meant being anti-Soviet. Mm-hmm. And so the two sort of reinforced each other. Being anti-Soviet meant, not automatically, but did mean in many contexts that you were probably Jewish. Mm-hmm. And being Jewish meant in a lot of contexts that you were probably anti-Soviet. Again, it wasn't a 100% guarantee, but it was likely enough.
And by the way, what year would this have been when you discovered that you had Jewish ancestry?
In the mid-60s, I would guess, early to mid-60s.
Right, so really at the height of the Cold War.
Yes, although again, the Cold War is an American concept, not really a Russian one.
Mm-hmm. In what sense?
So we didn't, at the time, we didn't really refer to it as the Cold War or Cold War era. Now it's used in Russian to refer to that period. But at the time, Cold War was something that was associated with Western terminology.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little about your Soviet identity as a citizen of the Soviet Union. So you have said you're anti-Soviet, but help us understand exactly what that means. Was it communism, or was it the Soviet regime that was your the thing that you didn't like?
Well, both. The idea was that the idea of communism was a utopian one, and perhaps an undesirable one, and that the regime based on that idea was illegitimate. Mm-hmm. So it was both. It was being anti-communist in principle, and being anti-Soviet in that the regime was seen as illegitimate.
And what about did you have an identity as a Russian?
I suppose so. But, you know, when you live in Russia, it's a default identity, really. So it doesn't mean, or it didn't mean as much to me then as it does now. Now I strongly identify with Russia. At the time, since everyone did, and but it was also an ideology to some extent, in that clearly I was taught also as a matter of principle to to love the Russian language and Russian literature, and as I actually try to write in the book, this love of the Russian language and literature is a kind of secular religion in the Soviet Union, was and still is in Russia.
In your article about Russian Soviet nationalism or nationalism within the Soviet Union, there was a few sentences there. We'll talk later about that article, but you wrote, every Soviet citizen was born into a certain nationality, took it to daycare and through high school, had it officially confirmed at the age of 16, and then carried it to the grave through thousands of application forms, certificates, questionnaires, and reception desks. It made a difference in school admissions, and it could be crucial in employment, promotions, and drafts assignments. So you're describing a world that you knew pretty well,
Absolutely.
I guess. Yeah, and so as a Jew, as a person of Jewish ancestry, is a better way to say that, you basically would put your Jewish identity or not, or would it be a Russian identity? What were you in the context of this?
In my own mind, I was, and indeed there was, according to the prevailing Soviet terminology, I was a half-breed, and I would refer to myself when asked in conversation by friends and so on, I'd say I am half and half, half Jewish, half Russian. Because again, Jewishness was an ethnic category in the Soviet Union. Had to do with your blood, not your convictions or whatever religion. But I was, I guess, unprincipled enough to put down Russian in all my official paperwork, because obviously it made it much easier to get into college and to avoid being ridiculed and that sort of thing. Again, it wasn't really being unprincipled, because certainly when I was young, and I didn't really think of myself as Jewish. I just knew that my mother had Jewish Jewish background.
So then tell us a little about your education in the Soviet Union. What did you study? What were your interests?
Well, I was interested in history, but I studied literature. I was interested in literature as well, but history departments were heavily ideological, with a lot of time devoted to the study of Marxism-Leninism. So studying literature seemed to be a better option. So I went to Moscow University, to the so-called philology department, where I studied linguistics and literature. But I was always interested in history. And so when I came over here, I went to graduate school in the Department of History.
And before you came here to do graduate work at the University of Texas, you did some traveling. Tell us a little about that, because I think you mention in your book that it sensitized you to some of the issues that you became interested in over time. You were in Mozambique, is that?
Right.
And that was after your degree in Moscow and before you came to...
So I was there for a year, and then I went back.
Teaching? Were you teaching?
No, I was an interpreter.
Interpreter, okay.
A Portuguese-Russian interpreter. And then I went back to Russia, worked for about a year and a half there in a publishing house. And then I immigrated and I left for Portugal, where I lived for a year. And so I first came to this country as a Portuguese graduate student.
With a Portuguese passport.
Right.
So you've been good at, you have multiple identities.
I do.
Which makes you flexible, and also will be an insight into kind of when we talk about your work in a minute. And when did you come to the University of Texas? What year?
It was in January 1983.
Okay, 1983. Before the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right.
What was your, how did the collapse of the Soviet Union affect your thinking?
Well, it made me feel different about my home country. I mean, it made me feel different about a number of things. I mean, obviously, it's not every day that the country where you were born disappears from the map. It forced me to think of Soviet history in different ways, I guess. But most important for me, it made me realize that I had emigrated from the Soviet Union, not really from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So I identify more, I guess, strongly with Russia today than I did before the Soviet Union collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
So now that the regime, in other words, is not in the way, it's kind of easier to be Russian.
Mm-hmm. So was this, in what ways was this disorienting, or was it less disorienting and giving you a more sense of who you were?
Well, it was exhilarating and exciting. It was. I felt bad I was here during the events of 1991, the attempted coup d'état, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rallies, the demonstrations, the anticipation.
Mm-hmm.
The change, you know, I started going back. I went back for the first time in '89, I think.
After the fall, or
right?
Yeah.
Well, it was the Soviet Union still existed, but the regime that I had sort of grown up with was no longer there for all practical purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So there was freedom of expression, there was street demonstrations, there were all kinds of articles in newspapers. So it was a very exciting time to go back.
Before we talk about your book, let's talk a little about doing history. What do you think are the important skills for students to have if they wanted to pursue a career in Russian history? My sense is that for you, literature is very important in understanding what's going on.
You mean Russian literature?
Yeah, right.
Russian history specifically, as opposed to history in general. Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to know the language, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In addition to being curious. And I think it's true of the study of any culture, that you should know the language and the culture. And so it may even be truer of Russia because of this intense cult of literature in Russian society, and the frequency with which people use quotations from poetry in their speech, in their writings. So if you want to understand those nuances, then you better read a lot of literature.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk a little about your book, and I will show it to our audience again, The Jewish Century. It's a very complex book with many themes, and I want to pursue some of the important themes. And one is, in your first chapter, you place the Jewish people in the context, really, of other people, similar social and functional roles. Now, I think you mentioned that you were sensitized to this because of your trip to Mozambique. You saw the Indians there, right, and their role. Talk a little about that, and then let's talk a little about your argument seeing the Jews as what you call Mercurians as opposed to Apollonians.
Apollonia.
Yeah, Apollonians.
It's not a very particularly original observation, because the Indians are known as the Jews, or some people call them the Jews of East Africa. But it was striking to me when I was in East Africa to see Indians perform pretty much the same functions as Jews had in Central Europe and the Russian Empire. And not only perform the same functions, but being perceived in the same way. Feared, disliked, admired, in pretty much the same terms. Mm-hmm. Moreover, I didn't know many Indians in Mozambique, but I knew some, and my sense at the time was that they viewed their neighbors, clients, customers, in ways that were similar to the way the Russian Jews had viewed their peasant Ukrainian, Belarusian, Lithuanian neighbors. And so it just sort of struck me how similar their situations and in some ways identities were, and made me curious about this as a comparative phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. You conceptualize this status and role and name it after the gods, right. The god Mercury. So explain what a Mercurian is in your terms, a concept which you apply both to the Jews and to the Indians and other peoples, actually.
Well, what I argue is that in traditional societies, and I do not in this context talk about industrial, post-industrial societies, but in so-called traditional societies, one could divide societies into two basic categories: food producers and service providers. Obviously, there are service providers within any society, but what I find interesting is that there were whole ethnic groups, demographically complete societies that did not engage in food production and specialized in providing services to the surrounding food-producing population. And those communities, again, those ethnic groups that specialized exclusively in the provision of services, I call Mercurians after the god of commerce and trade, and the god of messengers, guides, healers, all kinds of border crossers and go-betweens.
And what are their characteristics?
Well, they are strangers by vocation, by trade, by definition. They have to be strangers in order to perform their function, and they can perform their function because they're strangers. So in order to remain strangers, they have to do certain things or be a certain way, behave in a certain way. And so it is true of most Mercurians, of most ethnic groups who do these things, that they tend to speak a language that is foreign to the surrounding population. They either bring such a language with them or they invent one. They tend to have fairly rigid dietary taboos. They do not share meals with their clients. They tend to be endogamous. They do not share wives with their clients. And if you don't share wives and meals with your neighbors, you clearly are going to be a radical stranger. That is one way not to sort of engage with others, not to be able to accept hospitality, or indeed to offer hospitality. They are, again, by definition, transients, wanderers, travelers. And that is true not only of nomadic groups, but even of settled groups such as Eastern European Jews, who think of themselves as exiles, who may live in one place for hundreds of years, but are committed to the idea that they are not from around here, that they belong somewhere else. So those would be, they tend to present themselves in a way that would be sort of a mirror image to the way they understand their hosts to be. Men are usually pointedly non-belligerent. So, and again, not fighting is a good way not to engage in sort of cross-cultural interaction. The women, on the other hand, are perceived as aggressive and sometimes therefore attractive, and so on. So they share certain traits.
These groups, that is.
All of those groups, right? Yeah. And they tend to view their clients and customers and hosts, however you call them, in similar ways, and they tend to be perceived by those groups in similar ways. And I think it's true of, overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, and Indians in Africa, and the Lebanese in West Africa, or indeed in South America, and all sorts of other groups, in the Middle East in particular, Africa.
Now, distinguish the Mercurians. Briefly tell us a little about the other main category, which is identified with the god Apollo.
Well, Apollonia, again, Apollo was the god of both livestock and agriculture. So Apollonian societies, the way I use the term, are societies that are organized around food production, that can feed themselves. Societies that consist, in the traditional era, that used to consist mostly of peasants and various combinations of warriors and priests who expropriate peasant labor by controlling access to land or salvation. But essentially those are societies whose origins are in the production of food, or a particular way of producing food. Usually traditional ethnographers distinguish between between hunting-gathering, agricultural, and pastoral societies. And so what I am proposing is that we add another category, that there was another way of making a living that was actually quite traditional and fairly common. This way that is, can be known as Jewish, or if you will, Armenian. But it is an old way of life, way of making a living. To specialize exclusively in the provision of services.
We're talking again about the Mercurian.
We have returned, right, sort of juxtaposing the Apollonians and the Mercurians.
Right. Now, your hypothesis here really offers an important insight into the roots of anti-Semitism. Talk a little about that, and not just anti-Semitism, the riots against Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. It sort of follows almost from what you're proposing, right?
Right. So what the idea is that there is really nothing unique about anti-Semitism. There may be something unique about particular forms of anti-Semitism, but this particular sort of dislike of the Jews is comparable and indeed very similar to the dislike of the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, or in Indonesia, of the Indians in East Africa, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, in what is now Azerbaijan as well, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Now the next important element in the equation that you're proposing is really the extent to which Mercurians, and in particular the Jews in Europe, played a central role because of these skills, because of their social role, in positioning themselves as agents of modernity as modernization came to Europe, changed Europe through industrialization, through international commerce, and so on. Talk a little about that, because it becomes a very important element in the story you're telling.
Right. I do not argue that the Jews were instrumental in bringing modernity to Europe. What I am arguing is that they were very successful at being modern, because some of the things that they had specialized in, finance, law, entrepreneurship, medicine, things that used to be dangerous, used to be viewed with suspicion, were now in great demand. Moreover, were now the most fundamental features of modernity. Those most in demand, those that would lead to a great deal of success, prestige, and so on. And so these traditional Jewish specialties, such as entrepreneurship, law, medicine, what would become the media, in other words, these intermediary activities, would place them at the top, or at least in some key positions in the modern world. And that obviously leads to success on the one hand and to resentment on the other.
Now, as a historian of Russia and of the Soviet Union, you see the Jews as performing a very important role, bringing these skills to the aftermath of the communist revolution. Talk a little about that, because this wasn't the first time this had happened in Russia. In an earlier period, it had been Germans that had played an important role in the consolidation and modernization of the Tsarist state.
Right. Well, the Jews were prominent enough in some of the same spheres, banking, various forms of entrepreneurship, law, medicine, in Imperial Russia as well. But there were various constraints on their status, on how far they could go. And so after the revolution, with the abolition of the so-called Pale of Settlement, of all kinds of restrictions, residential and otherwise, they migrated en masse from the former Pale of Settlement, from where they used to live in what is now Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania primarily, to the big cities of the Soviet Union, and did exceedingly well in the new Soviet education system. And that's a big part of the story that I am telling in the book. With this, what's important to me is not only to talk about the role of Jews in the creation of the Soviet state, and they, by the way, not only did they do very well in the Soviet education system, but they welcomed the Soviet regime more warmly, so to speak, than most other groups in the Soviet Union. But in any case, it was important for me to point out that this was a migration, that we could talk about this movement of Jews to Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities of the Soviet Union in the same way we could talk about the movement of their cousins, brothers, sisters at the same time to Palestine and to the United States, among other places.
Just to pursue this point about the Jewish impact as a result of the migration, it is also the case that in the interwar period, and maybe even a little before, Jews assumed very important roles in other parts of Europe. For example, Austria, Hungary, and even Germany.
Right. But I suppose the difference, and again, in some of the same spheres of activity: higher education, law, medicine, and so on, science, journalism, entertainment. I suppose the greatest difference was, number one, that of course private entrepreneurship was outlawed in the Soviet Union, and Jews suffered disproportionately as a result. So a very high proportion of traders, businessmen who were deprived of their rights and often arrested, had their property confiscated, were Jewish. On the other hand, I suppose the other important difference was that in the Soviet Union, state employment was open to there was no official anti-Semitism at all in the Soviet Union. There were fairly effective campaigns against anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union in the interwar period. And so that resulted in the fact that there was a very high proportion of ethnic Jews. And again, we know we're talking about Jews as an ethnic group in this case, right? Or we can call them just immigrants from the Jewish Pale of Settlement, or people from Jewish homes, they were very well represented in government positions, in the police, in the armed forces, among generals, and so on.
And scientists,
Among
too.
diplomats, as well as, but as I was saying, science, medicine, law, that was common right throughout Europe. But if we look at some of the differences between the Soviet Union, the position of Jews in the Soviet Union in that period, and the position of Jews in Europe, the greatest differences would be the lack of this sort of entrepreneurial route in the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, the openness of the state. And again, the fact that, of course, the Russian Revolution resulted in the destruction of the old elite, sort of gentry elite or ethnic German elite. They were gone, and so there was no former sort of pre-existing elite for these emerging young Jews to compete with. So their success was even more spectacular than their success in places such as Budapest or Berlin or Vienna or New York.
And now to the next chapter in the story that you're telling, and that really is that what Jews confronted after being the agents and participants in modernization was the rise of a nationalism which essentially tapped this need on the part of the people you identify with Apollo to exclude the strangers, to turn against the groups, and in Europe Jews were very important, that had helped bring this new era. But now the new era was encapsulated in the nationalist form. Talk a little about that.
Well, the Jews were identified with modernity, and some of the most obvious new traits of European states, and admired as a consequence, but also resented. In the Soviet Union, the story was interesting in that, of course, the regime started out as a cosmopolitan internationalist regime, opposed to nationalism in principle, a regime that assumed that the sort of communist future would be that without ethnicity, without tribalism. But that began, and that, of course, is what attracted so many Jews to communism, or at least one of the things that attracted them to communism. But that began to change in the Soviet Union in the interwar period, basically starting in the mid-1930s. And the Soviet Union began to be identified increasingly with the Russian Empire, began to sort of to think of itself, the regime began increasingly to think of itself as an heir, the Russian Empire, Russian culture, a Russian sort of imperial idea, and so on. And it became associated increasingly with the Russian people understood in ethnic terms. And particularly after the so-called Great Terror, most of the new top officials in the Soviet Union were newly promoted ethnic Russians of peasant and blue-collar background. And so the atmosphere changed, and the ideology began slowly but surely to change. And so all of a sudden, it turned out that this new Soviet intelligentsia, of which the regime was so proud, and Stalin in particular was so proud, was in some ways not Soviet because it wasn't Russian, because so many of them were ethnic Jews. And that became a more or less explicit issue for both parties, for the state and for the former Jews who were now Soviet intellectuals or officials, whatever, during the war, during World War II.
And the hidden secret here was the importance of Russia and the Russian identity, which was submerged within the Soviet identity as the policymakers were reinforcing the ethnic identities of all the people who were part of the empire.
Right. Well, yes. This, as I say, the Soviet Union was increasingly represented as primarily Russia, and then various allied nations and quasi-states around it. And the Soviet people were represented as a fraternal group led by the older brother, the first among equals, the Russians. And Stalin emphasized that during the war, because he clearly used Russian patriotism, traditional Russian patriotism, Russian actually Christianity, as an important way to mobilize the population, the majority of the population, for the war effort, and even more so after the war, more explicitly so after the war. One of Stalin's most famous speeches was a toast he raised publicly after the war to the great Russian nation, which he characterized as the glorious nation, a special nation that was responsible for defeating the Nazis and so on. So as a result of that, and there were other nations recognized as a part of the Soviet Union, but Jews were not. And of course, at the same time that the Soviet state was emphasizing the role of ethnic Russians, some of these ethnic Jews, as a result of what the Nazis were doing, as well as a result of what Stalin was doing and saying, were thinking of themselves as Jews more and more, and wondering more and more about what it meant. Because clearly, since the Germans singled them out from among the Soviets, and then the Soviets, some Soviets began to single them out as not quite Soviet, because they weren't quite Russians or anything else associated with the Soviet Republic. They began to wonder more and more. And of course, that in turn reinforced the suspicion on the part of some members of this new ruling establishment within the Communist Party.
So the Jewish dilemma became that their great success as cosmopolitans, in a way, now confronted different types of nationalism or organizations that promoted nationalism, and they were essentially a people without a place where they could realize their nationalism within Europe.
Right. They, in a world of various nationalisms, in a world of states organized around the concept of ethnicity, in a world of nation-states, they seemed to be outsiders and outcasts. In the Soviet case, it was ironic because they, in some ways, were more loyal to the official ideology than a lot of other people, more committed to it. And that made their dilemma all the stranger in the Soviet Union. So and that's what makes their sort of trajectory in the Russian case so peculiar. And that was one of the questions that I had when I first approached this subject, is the sort of the riddle of the transformation of the most Soviet and the most successful of all Soviet ethnic groups into the most anti-Soviet and still the most successful of all Soviet ethnic groups. The dilemma that struck me in college, actually, when I was surrounded by ethnic Jews, all of whom were members of this sort of the westernizing anti-Soviet wing of the Soviet intelligentsia, and many of whom were the grandchildren of communists. And none of them at the time wondered how that transformation had occurred. because they took their sort of anti-Soviet intelligentsia status for granted, and didn't tend to, we didn't tend to kind of wonder why it was so.
Now, for the next chapter, to explain what happens next, you turn to Shalom Aleichem's Tevye, the Dairyman, which was made in America into the musical and movie Fiddler on the Roof, to look at, and you look at the choices of three of his daughters, and in a way, each one of them makes a choice that actually was a choice for the Jewish people. And that is a choice between going to Palestine, finding at last the homeland, going to Russia, which we've just talked about, and how that unraveled, and then thirdly, coming to the United States. Talk a little about those three options and how they played out. I mean, what was distinctive about America, what was distinctive about Russia, and what was distinctive about Palestine?
Well, you characterized them very well.
Yeah.
Those three migrations, as you say, were also three ideological pilgrimages, three political existential options, right? Three ways of being Jewish in the modern world, and indeed three ways of being modern in the modern world. And so one was non-ethnic liberal statehood in the United States. Another one was secular ethnic nationalism in Palestine. And the third was communism, was this hope to create a world without either capitalism or tribalism, a world that was sort of based on the rejection of the American way on the one hand and the Zionist way on the other, so sort of in the minds of many of the Jews who opted for it. And so what is important for me to emphasize is just how terribly important the communist route was, that the migration to Moscow was incomparably larger than the migration to Palestine. And while it was about as large as the migration from the Russian Empire to America, but it was much more politically charged. Again, this is not to say that every participant in one of those three migrations did it consciously and made a rational choice. But I think those migrations do reflect the sort of three dominant positions within the Jewish community in Eastern Europe at the time.
Now, the Jewish community in the United States, the Jewish community, well, the Jews in Israel, and the Jews in the Soviet Union, their interaction, in a way, played an important role in the fall of the Soviet Union, in the sense that the Jewish neocons here were influencing legislation about immigration of the Jews from the Soviet Union. So this was a piece of the whole pressure on the Soviet Union, which led to its collapse. And the immigrants from the Soviet Union, one of their destinations was Israel, which needed more people to balance the birth rates of the Arab populations. What are your thoughts on that interplay of these forces? This is not the only explanation of why the Soviet Union fell, but it's a kind of a dialogue between these three communities that became very important in shaping what happened.
Yes, it was. It's very important, I think, to remember that the people who at about the same time migrated from pretty much the same place to the United States, to Russia, and to Palestine, that they were, in some cases, interchangeable. They were the same people, or they were closely related. They would be relatives, literally, in some cases, or they'd be neighbors, and some would go to New York, and some would go to Moscow, and very few would go to Palestine. And they retained, I think many of them retained some memory of their common origin. Some, certainly for the longest time they corresponded with each other. Some people, and I have some examples in my book, would go to one place and then to another and then to the third and so on. Of course, many immigrants to the Jewish immigrants to the United States were communist. The American communism as an ideology, as a movement, was largely a Russian Jewish phenomenon. There were many in Palestine early on who sympathized with the Soviet Union. There were some Zionists in Russia and so on and so forth. They, throughout the century, they all kept sort of looking at each other. And I think in the eyes of most Jews who emigrated from the Russian Empire, and that including, parts of Poland and so on, the Soviet option was by far the most successful. I would say that for the majority of the Jews in the interwar period, in the 1920s and 30s, it was the migrants to Moscow who had the best deal, who were the most successful, who were associated with the greatest hope, with this wonderful experiment, and so on and so forth. But then, of course, things began to change. The Six-Day War, the emergence, the creation of Israel was a very important event, of course, and then the war, the Six-Day War, which played a very important role in creating a sort of new nationalist Jewish ideology among Soviet Jews. It was at least as important in the Soviet Union for the Soviet Jews as it was for the American Jews, here. And the sort of turn in the United States within the Jewish community from liberalism to, in some quarters, let's say, to Jewish nationalism, right? This sort of special relationship with Israel and strong identification with Israel, support for Israel politically, special pride associated with Israel, and so on. And so, of course, all those things, all three communities kept influencing each other. And so in that sense, so speaking specifically of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, those are not the causes of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it was an important element in the late Soviet history, and certainly in the story of Soviet Jews, that there was Israel that presented an alternative and helped them form a new kind of national and nationalist identity. And then, of course, the fact that American Jews in the 1970s, sort of late 60s, 1970s, so many of them were turning from radicalism, sort of 1960s radicalism, which in turn was clearly related, sort of genealogical to socialism, to various forms of socialism in the 1920s and 30s, and sort of universal liberalism, to, as I said, to various forms of Jewish nationalism. And a part of that, or one consequence of that, was the movement to help Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. So in a way we can say that the American Jews realized best in the long term the Mercurian role. They received the most fruits from the genealogy of having that Mercurian role. Whereas in Israel, what you had was becoming like the disciples of Apollo, basically. What were the consequences of those things? Does that help us understand, for example, some of the actions that Israel has wound up taking, which, that is the notion that in Israel the Jews were going to be like all the other nations, but now are engaged in activities that are being criticized by the community of nations?
Yeah, clearly the Zionist option was a an explicit rejection of the Mercurian way of life, as I call it, right, of sort of diaspora Jewish culture. It was something embarrassing, something to get away from. And so the idea was to create a nation of warriors, a nation of farmers. And so it was the most sort of resolute rejection of traditional diaspora Jewish life. As you say, in the United States, of course, the greatest difference was the fact that the American state is not ethnically defined, that the American nation is not ethnically defined, and so Jews could pursue sort of the things that they were good at without being punished, so to speak, or resented by any group that could claim the monopoly of politics, or could claim that the state was by right theirs, the way ethnic Russians could in Russia, and the Spaniards could in Spain, and the Germans could and certainly did in Germany. So in some ways, the United States ended up being or the American option ended up being the most successful one.
Mm-hmm. One final question, and the question is this, and before you answer it, I'm going to read something from the preface of your book. In finding the story of the Jews in the 20th century, what did you learn about yourself? That's my final question. And then I want to go back to your preface, where you write about your two grandmothers, and excuse my pronunciations, but one of your grandmothers was Angelina Zdanovich, and she had Cossack ancestors, and she lost everything in the revolution. And you write of her, at the end of her life, she was a loyal Soviet citizen at peace with her past and at home in her country. And your other grandmother was Bertha Kostrinitsky, and she was born in the Pale. She emigrated to Argentina. She returned in the 1930s to take part in the building of socialism. And then, quote, you write, in her old age, she took great pride in her Jewish ancestors and considered most of her life to have been a mistake. This book is dedicated to her memory. So my question is, in telling this story about the Jews in the 20th century, what did you learn about yourself?
Well, I now have a slightly better idea of what it means to be Jewish than I did when I first asked my father about my neighbor. I also have a slightly better idea of what it means, or am more self-reflexive about what it means to be Russian. But I learned a lot more about my grandparents than I did really about myself, although of course one way to learn about ourselves is to learn about our grandparents. And that's partly what history is about. But I think I at least tried to answer the question, and answered it more or less to my own satisfaction, of why such grandmothers raised such grandchildren. You know, sort of answered the question that occurred to me when I was back in Russia in college. So that would be the most important one, I guess.
Yuri, on that note, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for writing this book. And let me show the book again, The Jewish Century, published by Princeton University. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.